Good morning, everybody. Happy Monday. We have an amazing show for everybody today. What do we have, Krystal?
Indeed we do. We got a lot of breaking news with regards to Israel. So first of all, Benny Gantz is out of the government, of that war cabinet. He announced that he is pressuring for a ceasefire deal. We've got Tony Blinken, who is there in the region as well. So a lot to get to there and what that could mean. We have 4 Israeli hostages rescued and roughly 1,000 Palestinians killed or injured in that operation by the IDF, and some questions about American involvement. So a lot to get to there. That's very consequential. We have new polls out with some interesting insights into whether or not Trump's convictions are going to matter, and then whether or not people really care about them. The answer appears to basically be not so much. Very interesting things coming out of Europe as well. They had the EU parliamentary elections, and in particular in France and Germany, huge surge for the far right. Macron has announced snap elections, so that is kind of fascinating. Sometimes that can be a canary in the coal mine for our own politics, so we want to take a look at that. And we also have Brianna Joy Gray fired by The Hill. Needless to say, Saagar and I both have some thoughts and potential insights there to share with you.
Never heard of it. Never heard of it.
Former Hill refugees ourselves, yes. We've got some thoughts about what's going on there.
All right, that's right. Okay, before we get to that, we actually have a major story coming later today. We weren't able to fit it in the show for timing reasons from Ryan Grimm. We're going to be interviewing him. He's going to be breaking some major Supreme Court related news. So everybody stay tuned on all of our channels. We will be posting that and we'll email it out to premium subscribers as well. But we are expecting this to actually make some news and possibly picked up by the mainstream press. So it's going to be a fun day here at Breaking Points. If you want to support our work, breakingpoints.com. We really appreciate it. But with that, let's get to the Benny Gantz news.
All right, so Benny Gantz announced a press conference and he made it official that he was leaving the war cabinet. We've got a little bit of the coverage from Sky News, which has the advantage of being in English. So let's take a listen to a little bit of what he had to say.
We can tell you that he is unhappy with the apparent lack of a plan for after the war with Gaza. He has been threatening to resign. He was going to release a statement yesterday, but the news that those 4 Israeli hostages had been rescued from Gaza meant his statement was delayed until today. But in the last few moments, he has resigned from the Israeli war cabinet. He says in Netanyahu's government, political considerations are impeding strategic decisions in the Gaza war. He also says that Benjamin Netanyahu is preventing real victory. We are leaving emergency government, he says. He also calls on Benjamin Netanyahu to set an agreed election date. And he's been calling on the Defence Minister, Yoav Gallant, to be brave and do what is right, and presumably follow his lead by resigning from the war cabinet.
There was also a major military official who just announced his resignation as well, who was in charge of the Gaza area and said, I've basically failed on October 7th to keep Israelis safe. Benny Gantz, as part of that press conference, he also apologized to the hostage families and asked for their forgiveness, saying, quote, "We failed. The responsibility is also mine." So you guys will recall the war cabinet is made up of Netanyahu, was Benny Gantz, and Yoav Gallant. Now, moderate in the Israeli context, always keep in mind, none of these people are against the war. None of them are quote unquote moderate. However, there are some differences in terms of how they wanted to approach things. Gantz in particular is more favorable towards the ceasefire deal that has been floated by Joe Biden. Yoav Gallant seems to be more in that direction as well. Both of them have been pushing for a plan for the quote unquote day after. And so that's why Saagar is really noteworthy, and also not surprising that he points to Netanyahu and says basically, you're putting politics first. You don't actually care about the war. You don't care about the hostages. You don't care about Israel. You care about your own political survival. And Gantz had previously issued an ultimatum basically saying, listen, you need to call for elections. We need some sort of concrete workable plan for the quote unquote day after in Gaza. Otherwise, I'm leaving the war cabinet. And that, in fact, is what he has done now.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Really what it comes down to is the both domestic political situation, but also Gantz is not an idiot. He basically basically has the tacit backing of the United States. The Biden government, the European Union, he's not facing any international problems. If Netanyahu goes away, A, he's likely going to face a criminal trial for his own corruption allegations that predate long October 7th. But second, he's actually got to grapple with his political legacy. Just to explain to people, because it's a little bit confusing, this does not actually bring down the Netanyahu government. His old coalition, pre-October 7th coalition, still stands. He has a 64-seat majority in the Israeli parliament. The question then comes to the shakiness of that, the calling for the election. And really the way I guess people could think about it for historical context is when Clement Attlee left the government of the wartime coalition after Britain won the Second World War. And they called for an election, and actually Churchill ended up being defeated. So possibly there could be some parallels there. The point, though, is just that the shakiness brings effectively domestic politics, as in like capital P politics, back to the country of Israel, which has been totally united on a domestic front. Interestingly enough, this is the only question, is the timing of the so-called hostage mission, because, and we're going to get to this, but it really affected Benny Gantz. He originally had the speech on the books for withdrawing the day of the hostage release. He ended up having to cancel his speech, but that is probably the single most popular thing that Netanyahu has done since what? Since October 7th. Prior to that. The best thing that he possibly could have done for his political future. So this actually does raise the question of maybe he could survive. It's certainly possible. It's going to be a big question of both international politics, how the Israeli people themselves feel about it, and also, don't forget this, Gantz could still lose. It's very, very possible. It could be that some Likud successor to Netanyahu or somebody who's like him actually does end up prevailing in an election. None of the baggage, same hardline policy, very, very possible for the future.
So right after October 7th, both Benny Gantz and Yair Lapid, who is like the opposition leader, were approached about joining this, temporary war cabinet government. And Gantz demanded that the most far-right psychos, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, were they didn't have to be pushed out of government entirely, but they couldn't be part of the war cabinet. And Lapid had a more hardline position of, these guys can't be involved in all, and that's my condition. And Netanyahu said no. And so Yair Lapid remained outside of the war cabinet government. I read a Haaretz analysis that basically, really said Benny Gantz has sort of propped up Netanyahu here, has really given him a legitimacy that he didn't deserve, and gave him a sort of grace with the public that allowed him to persist in this role for this long. Now, the counter side of that would be, well, Gantz pressured for, the original ceasefire deal that led to, very brief pause in hostilities and the release of a certain number of hostages. And perhaps if Gantz hadn't been in the war cabinet, maybe that wouldn't have happened. Perhaps, but there were other pressures on Netanyahu at that point as well. So that's some of the Israeli domestic debate. To the extent that there's a moderate coalition in Israel, they basically feel that Benny Gantz stayed far too long and perhaps shouldn't have ever taken part in this to begin with. So as I mentioned before, and Saagar, you alluded to, we can put this up on the screen, Tony Blinken, State Department, our Secretary of State, will arrive in Israel today and meet with Gantz and Netanyahu. The U.S. is also pushing this supposedly Israeli ceasefire deal that, of course, now Israel is not willing to actually back, some resolution through the UN Security Council. So the U.S. is sort of, working on pushing that through the UN Security Council. There's a lot of questions over. It appears that the hostage deal isn't really moving anywhere anyway. So I'm seeing all these headlines that are like, Benny Gantz leaving the government complicates the hostage ceasefire negotiations. And I don't really know that that's the case, because it doesn't appear that they're actually moving anyway. So if anything, maybe it shakes it up, maybe it shakes something loose. I don't know. We could put this up on the screen also about the domestic political reaction from significant Israeli political figures. Netanyahu mulls dissolving the war cabinet. Ben-Gvir is demanding a seat at the table. We've got Bibi putting out this strange tweet, in my opinion. Cryptic, doesn't actually mention Benny Gantz, but that's clearly who this is about. He says, Israel's in an existential war on several fronts. My son, this is not the time to abandon the campaign. This is the time to join forces. Citizens of Israel, we will continue until victory and the achievement of all the goals of the war, primarily the release of all our hostages and the elimination of Hamas. My door will remain open to any Zionist party that is ready to get under the stretcher. And this is, by the way, the Google Translate, so I don't know if this The reason it seems weird might be because of the Google translation, but anyway, ready to get under the stretcher and assist in bringing victory over our enemies and ensuring the safety of our citizens. We've got opposition leader Yair Lapid saying, Gantz's and Eisenkot's decision to leave the failed government is important and correct. The time has come to replace this extreme and reckless government with a sane government that will lead to the return of security to the citizens of Israel, to the return of the hostages, to the restoration of Israel's economy and international status. So this is the primary opposition leader to Netanyahu. Of course, he's very interested in elections sooner rather than later. And then you have National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir. Put this next one up on the screen. He says, as a minister in the government, chairman of a party, and a senior partner in the coalition, I hereby demand to join this cabinet in order to be a partner in determining Israel's security policy in the current times. It's time to make brave decisions. So one of the most psychotic members of the Netanyahu coalition now asking to be included in the war cabinet. At the same time, we can put this up on the screen in terms of, I alluded to this before, where we are with the ceasefire negotiations. Washington Post headline, despite Biden's urging, ceasefire deal shows no progress. As I alluded to before, they're pushing this UN Security Council resolution. Whether that gets through, whether that makes a difference, I don't know, seems kind of unlikely. But they're reporting here, they say more than a week after President Biden declared a decisive moment in the 8-month Israel-Gaza war and beseeched both sides to quickly approve a US-backed ceasefire deal, there is dwindling evidence that either has bought what he is selling. Despite Biden's personal and very public urging, his dispatch of senior administration officials to the region, the drafting of a new UN Security Council resolution, and the marshaling of allies to join in a chorus of approval, neither Israel nor Hamas appear to have budged on their wide divergence over the proposed roadmap to permanently end the war in Gaza. Israel's successful rescue of 4 hostages early Saturday, while welcomed, may further complicate administration efforts, bolstering Prime Minister Netanyahu's insistence on a full military victory and release of all remaining Hamas-led held hostages before Israel's guns are silenced. So the big divide in terms of a ceasefire is basically Hamas wants the war to end and Israel, Bibi Netanyahu, does not want the war to end. So that has been a fairly unbridgeable divide for some time now. Biden tried to put pressure on through this big speech that he gave and, rhetoric effectively, but Saagar once again appears that he is set up for a massive humiliation here because he's unwilling to actually use the tools and leverage that the U.S. government has outside of his own rhetoric, which clearly has been insufficient.
It reminds me a lot of the Obama administration's handling of Syria. It was very similar. It was very haphazard. It was all over the place. They would try and strike ceasefires. They would try and strike grand bargains. At the same time, we had our own radical, what were they called? Moderate rebel policy. It was just like a failure. Oh, but also Assad can't use chemical weapons, but also if he does, maybe, but also maybe he didn't. It's just, it's just complete incompetence. And that really is a lot of the same characters are involved, literally, Brett McGurk and others who are the ones jet setting. Anthony Blinken was in the State Department at that time, and they seem to just be recreating that policy. They're banking everything on this ceasefire agreement, which neither side particularly seems like they want to do. And they also are banking everything on this very bizarre Saudi normalization deal. Arguably, that Saudi deal is going to be the most important thing that could come out of this, because they're effectively going to give the Saudis an extension of non-NATO major ally status and security guarantee the entire country, which is insane, just so everybody understands, and change of our policy to the region almost dramatically escalates, U.S. involvement and basically ties us to 2 countries in the Middle East, as opposed to just kind of trying to at least to be above the fray. Traditionally is what we always tried to do. We always usually wanted a balance of power approach. Here we would explicitly align ourselves in legal fashion with a single nation, and that almost guarantees some sort of confrontation with Iran coming down the title. Of course, that's what a lot of people in this town want, so don't put that past them. But there's a lot of very consequential stuff that's happening here. I do think if Netanyahu is replaced, even with somebody like Gantz, look, you may not like the policy whenever it comes to Gaza, but internationally, I do think there would be a major change. And I think some sort of ceasefire or hostage deal seems a lot more likely. Those guys, Netanyahu is basically dead. His future is very uncertain. For them, it's not the same. They don't have all the baggage of the past. They want to try and, they can see, they're not stupid for what the future looks like for the nation. They want to dig themselves out of that hole. So in a way, I think that a Gantz, Lapid-led government, anything like that would be a dramatic improvement, for Israeli policy going forward.
The difference is, again, neither is opposed to the war. neither has any issue with the, massacres that have been committed and the, fact that Gaza's been effectively annihilated, reduced to rubble, the massive number of deaths and civilians who've been killed. None of them have any issue with that. Netanyahu, though, faces pressure from the far right, the literal terrorists who are in his government. And so he is constantly trying to split the difference between, maintaining some acceptability to the, what is the Israeli mainstream and these, really hardline, I think very fair to say, fascist individuals that are in his government. And so that's where he is pressured, which is why, you see him, you'll hear him say things that can be directly contradictory depending on the time. Mm-hmm. Benny Gantz and Yair Lapid are more likely to be influenced by the public that's on the side of, we just got to get the hostages
and
home.
more like the traditional secular coalition of Israel.
Right, exactly. And so there is, we've covered the polls here. Again, the Israeli public, Israeli Jews have no issue with the horrors that have been inflicted by the IDF. You have a number who say, hey, they haven't gone far enough. You only have 4% who say they've gone too far. So that's not where the pressure lies. However, we have also seen polling that says there is a clear majority in favor of prioritizing the release of the hostages over this fantasy of complete elimination of Hamas. And so if you had a Lapid or a Gantz who had more power, they would be pressured more by that public sentiment, and public opinion could lead to a different outcome. But Netanyahu shows no signs of calling new elections. There's no imminent sign that his government is going to collapse and force his hand there. So he's a wily guy, and with his political life on the line, and also, by the way, facing corruption charges that could literally land him in prison. At this point, he seems to be hanging in there. And he's thinking, hey, as friendly as Biden's been towards me, if I can hang in there through the November elections, Trump will be an even greater buddy to me and go along with whatever I want to do. So I think that's a calculation for him at this point.
I wouldn't bet against him. I still think I'd probably give him a 50% chance of survival, but that's a lot less than it has been in the future.
Yeah.
We'll see. I don't know. Things are definitely shaking up there, and it will go in two directions. He's either going to lose, and the center left / center right will take power, or he will remain in power by making common cause with, much more of the far Israeli right. Either, both, and that's the thing, let's not diminish it. It will have still major consequences for foreign policy. If that latter case I just described takes it, ceasefire is not only off the table, it just won't care anymore. They won't even pretend, to look at it. In terms of West Bank too, there could be a lot of different changes, while a Gantz government is going to handle that very, very differently going forward, and is going to be a lot more receptive to U.S. pressure and, public management of Israeli perception in the future with the European Union, with the U.S. So they have a choice, and we'll see which way it goes.
Yeah, Bibi hasn't really tried to even put a reasonable face on the horrors they're inflicting, whereas Gantz may go to greater lengths to sort of, provide some sort of cover for what they're doing.
He could end the war. It's very possible. In a lot of ways, you could look at it like this. They're like, look, the Rafah thing, it's not going to happen. Our partners are broadly not really with us. We could just sign this ceasefire deal. We call it when, we just move on. And then there'll be some humanitarian, the blaming, aid trucks, etc. I wouldn't put it outside the realm of possibility.
Yeah, but none of that's coming anytime soon.
No, I don't think it will.
Yeah, that's the bottom line.
Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show, help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.